So, for example, so it's easier to think of the opposite case, opposite case first, and then we'll go back to this. So a sample that is random by definition means that it doesn't have any biases. So bias is, what it sounds like is that if you have a bias, you have a preference, or you have a lack of preference for some particular thing. So for example, if you conducted your survey in front of Eastern Florida State College, then you would have a bias for only Eastern Florida State College students. And automatically, if you have a bias, that means that the sample is not random. And so what a bias, again, is that everybody who becomes part of your sample, you're preferring only certain kinds of people that are not necessarily represented in the population. So for example, if the population includes all Americans, yet you're only asking students from Eastern Florida State, then you have a bias for students at Eastern Florida State. So a sample that is random has no biases that you can think of at all. No preferential, no preference for anybody who becomes part of that sample. And so let's do some examples here. Let's say that there's a radio station and asks its listeners to call in and voice their opinion on a particular subject. For example, whether they approve the president. And let's say that everybody who calls into that radio station ends up being part of that sample. Is that a random sample?
Not necessarily, because not everyone listens to the radio and not everyone calls radio stations.
Okay, excellent. So when we say that the sample is not random, that means that there's one or more biases. So in other words, we're preferring certain types of people who end up part of that sample. So let's go ahead and identify as many biases as we can. So this will be exercise. So that example with the radio station callers. Let's identify the biases. And the biases are only certain kinds of people end up as part of this sample. So for example, you said only people who listen to the radio. That's one bias. What's another bias?
It might just be a regional radio, so it might only reach a certain amount.
Yeah, very good. So not only people who just listen to the radio, but not only that, more specifically, different radio stations have different demographics, location-wise, for example. So maybe only certain people within a certain radius of that radio channel would be able to listen to it. So only people within a geographic area. That's assuming it's not like satellite radio. Yeah.
The people who only like listen to that radio, because people
Only people who listen to that radio
Yeah.
station, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Only people in a certain geographic location. Or only people who listen to that station. What else?
people are only listening to the radio at that time.
Yeah, excellent. So that particular program where it's asking people to call in, was at a particular time, so only people who are available at that time are able to call in. Good. What else?
Only those who are able or have access to a telephone.
Yeah, very good. So once they listen to it, they have to have a phone to be able to call in the first place. And the point is that people who don't have a phone to be able to call in, their opinion is just as valid, but they're just not able to participate. Yeah.
People who are deaf.
Okay, good. So people with who are deaf, with hearing handicaps. Who have phones. Okay, anything else?
Like I said earlier, only the type of people who actively want to call in and publicly voice their opinion on a radio station.
Okay, excellent. So this is actually a very important type of bias called volunteer bias. So only people who choose to volunteer to be part of that sample can be part of the sample. And usually people who choose to actively volunteer are people who have opinions that are very strong one way or the other. Who actively very much like the president, or who actively very much dislike the president, will voice their opinion as to whether they like the president or not. But that leaves out lots of people who have more neutral opinions, but their opinions are just as valid. They're just not getting voiced. So this particular type of bias is called volunteer bias. It's actually a very important kind of bias that's prevalent in a lot of samples. Okay, so we have all these biases, and so the point is if you have a sample with one or more biases, then already it's not a random sample. And so you're gonna have to then go back and revise your sample so that you make sure that it doesn't have these biases. And if it doesn't have these biases, then it's a random sample and it's representative of the population. And then you can trust the result of your sample. Any questions or comments? All right, so let's practice some more. So let's do another example. So every week in the news, there's rankings that come out based on how many millions of Americans watch a certain TV show. And these ratings are big business because it determines how many millions of dollars a certain company pays for an advertising spot. It also determines how many millions of Americans are watching a certain TV show. So how do you think people determine how many millions of Americans watch a certain TV show? Yeah.
Well, I'm assuming they go on the streaming numbers directly.
So that could be. So nowadays we have more streaming being done by private companies like Hulu, Netflix, and so forth. But also there are these legacy networks like CBS and ABC that aren't quite fully privately owned, and they still have some government regulation. And so you would think that these companies could just monitor what you watch and just report it. Just say there's these many computers or TVs that were broadcasting, that were streaming from our channel, and just report that. But it turns out that because some of these platforms are still regulated by the government, it turns out that is illegal for privacy concerns. So it's illegal for example, ABC to monitor that you're watching them at that time and report that. So we can't, we don't have these direct numbers from the population. So what's actually done then is there's a sample that's collected, and there's a private company called Nielsen that knocks on people's doors and asks, is it okay that we put this black box and attach it to your TV set and monitor what you watch? And I know that sounds like a huge breach of privacy, but in order to offset that, we'll give you a couple $100. So that's basically what's done, and there's like 20,000 of these black boxes that are attached to random TV sets across the country. So these 20,000 boxes constitute this sample. And based on the sample, people then use statistics to make a conclusion about the actual number of Americans that watch each TV show, based on what they see in the sample. So this sample of 20,000 black boxes, do you think that this is a random sample?
No.
So think about whether so remember, a random sample means that there are no biases. So see if we can come up with any biases in the sample. For example, only certain kinds of people end up with the black box. Yeah.
I mean, the volunteer bias, so even
Yeah, very
having
good.
black boxes.
So already you see that there's volunteer bias. They have to agree to volunteer to have the black box and be part of the sample. Yeah.
People who have TVs.
Yeah, so only people who have TVs end up participating in the sample. But nowadays, so back in the old days, that was okay because only people who had TVs could watch TV in the first place. So that means that the restriction of only having a TV, the population had that as well. So that was okay. That wasn't a distortion from the population. So because this bias is a distortion from the population in that only people with TVs can participate in the sample, but the population is everybody who watches TV shows. But nowadays we know we can watch TV shows with lots of different ways. Not only TV, but Netflix, Hulu, streaming, and so forth. So we're gonna identify biases. One bias is volunteer bias. Another is only people with TVs can participate in this. What's another bias? Yeah, so let's try to come up with a way to fit that into a narrative as to how only certain types of ages become part of the sample, but it's not necessarily reflective of the whole population of ages. Yeah.
Maybe people that have access to like cable, maybe.
Okay, so how does that fit into that narrative of a bias where you're only preferring only certain types of people with cable, for example, that are not necessarily in the population at large? So in other words, a bias is you're preferring only certain types of people who become part of your sample.
You said they offer you money to give you the box, you could say bribery.
Yeah, very good. So only people who would become swayed by that. Only people who could be swayed by that, quote, bribery, right? So only people who could be incentivized to having one of these black boxes would agree to having the black box. So only people willing to be incentivized or able to be incentivized. I'll say by the money. So again, this would affect something more concrete, which is you would think that people who are able to be incentivized maybe have financial means that are less than people who would not agree to having the black box. And because of that, these other people who have lower financial means, maybe they're more prone to watch a certain type of TV show that the other people in the population might not watch. So that's why this would be seen. Yeah.
Only homeowners or people who have a house to have a TV in would be in that sample?
Yeah, maybe, or, well, wouldn't people who rent maybe?
Yeah,
Maybe not
and people, yeah.
Okay, good, so people who have a stable home, okay, good. Alright, what else?
Going back to the age thing, depending on how they do, I guess like the contract, they wouldn't sign it with a kid, or like, if a child comes up to the door and not an adult, they probably wouldn't, give it to the kid and be like, here, you're trusted to,
Ah, very good.
yeah,
Okay, so maybe people with predominantly more adults in the house?
yeah. Or if just
Yeah.
they come knocking on your door at the wrong time and say a parent or someone isn't home, then they would just move on.
Yeah, very good. So only people with adults available at certain times when people are knocking on the door. If you're working or going to school at that time, not even available to answer the door, then you can't even consider, whether to, or not to have this black box. So only people available at the time when the representative knocks. Okay, good. Anything else?
It doesn't count for like what people watch when they're on vacation, like at a hotel or something.
So right now what we're doing is trying to come up with biases, which means that, this setup is only favoring only certain types of people. So, yes, like what you said, there's gonna be other people who watch TV at hotels and so forth. But this is only, favoring people who watch TV at home. And I think that was mentioned before. Good, anything else? Okay, good, so I think you guys are getting the idea. So the point is that all these are different biases to indicate why this sample that consists of the 20,000 black boxes, why this is not a random sample. And if you have a sample that has even one bias, it's not random. The fact that this has this many biases contributes to it being that much not random. Okay, any questions or comments? Alright, so that said, you notice so far that we've been seeing this volunteer bias show up over and over. And that makes sense because volunteer bias just means that we're being decent people and respecting the fact that they can volunteer or they can consent to the survey or the poll. So do you think that volunteer bias is in every sample? Yeah, you would think, right? Just for decent legality reasons, volunteer bias should be in every sample. It turns out that there are real samples in real life that do not have volunteer bias. So let's talk more about them. So let's talk about two examples of real life samples that don't have volunteer bias. Samples without volunteer bias. So one example is from Facebook. Maybe not so surprising. So this was in the news a few years back. I don't know if you guys remember, but a few years back especially, Facebook was in a lot of hot water. And the reason for that is they're accused of manipulating their users. So what was happening was that I always have some students who refuse to be part of the grid and refuse to be part of any social network or online activity, and I respect that. So I'm gonna explain what Facebook is, even though you probably well know. So Facebook is an online social network that allows you to keep track of your friends and see what they voluntarily post about themselves. Including pictures, status updates, and so forth. Facebook was unique in being the first social network that had a news feed, which meant that on one page, you can see the activity of all or most of your friends on one page. You don't have to click on each friend individually to see what they're posting. So what Facebook did was, for some users, they would, on that user's newsfeed, they would show only good news or positive news or uplifting news to that particular person's newsfeed. They would basically cherry pick out only the good news and show it to that user. And another user, they would only show negative or depressing news from that person's newsfeed. They would cherry pick only the bad or depressing news and show it to that particular user. And they wanted to see what would happen. They wanted to see if a user saw only good or positive news on their newsfeed, would they in turn be in a good or positive mood and in turn post something good or positive on their own status post. And vice versa, a user who only saw negative or depressing news on their status, on their newsfeed, would they in turn only post something negative on their status post. So this is what Facebook did for months, and they didn't tell anybody that they were doing this. So basically, everybody that they did this with constituted this sample, and from this sample of people that they cherry-picked news from their newsfeed, they wanted to make a conclusion about the entire population of Facebook users. And so let's say they did it to a few thousand people, and so they wanted to see what the conclusion would be for the entire population of Facebook users. So this sample, did it end up being a random sample? So remember, you have to look at what the original population is, and the population is Facebook users. It's not the entire country, it's just Facebook users. So compared to the population of Facebook users, is this a random sample of that population?
Yes.
So are there any biases? Are we favoring any kinds of people in this sample?
People who use Facebook.
Yeah, but that is the population to begin with, so that's okay.
So it's right.
Maybe active users versus inactive users of Facebook? Could that possibly be a bias?
So that's a good point. So as long as, remember, your population is just everybody that you care about. So let's say that they only cared about active Facebook users. So in that case, this sample would have been representative of that.
So it's right.
Yeah, so in that case, and you notice that most of the time we have this volunteer bias, but in this example, do we have volunteer bias? No, because you didn't even give people a chance to consent or not. So because of that, there's no volunteer bias here, and their sample ended up being a random sample. And that's why they did this without telling anybody, so that they could have this random sample without any biases. Any questions? So while we're talking about it, what do you think the results were? If a user like you sees only positive news, does that affect your mood? Or if you only see negative news from your friends, does that affect your mood?
Yes.
Yes, it turns out that it does. And so this is great news for Facebook, because now they know they can manipulate your mood and sell you things accordingly based on your mood. For better or worse, they were able to know this. So, any questions? Okay, so we said that Facebook did this so that they could have a random sample that didn't have any biases, including volunteer bias. So they ended up doing this, so that means that it was legal. Whether or not it was ethical, that's another discussion. But why do you think it was legal for Facebook to be able to do this?
I mean, as soon as you make a Facebook account, you're already signing like your whole life away to begin with, so.
Yeah, so every new user who signs up for any of these accounts, there's an end user license agreement that's like 200 pages that nobody reads and signs anyway. And because that was signed, that gives a private company like Facebook the right to do that, the legal right. Any questions? Okay, so this is one example of a random sample without even volunteer bias. So let's talk about another example. So just like you expect, because we're trying to come up with a company without volunteer bias, just like you expect, it's also an internet company that made users sign an end user license agreement. So this is OkCupid. So in case you guys haven't heard of this company, this is a online dating company. This was big maybe like around 2010. After that, like 2015 and on, it kind of online dating kind of got overtaken by like Tinder and Bumble, the swipe right companies. But back in around 2010, OkCupid and companies that required you to fill out a profile and relied on users to care about what people wrote about themselves. These were the companies that were bigger back then. Okay, so OkCupid was an online dating company, and so the way that online dating works is that you're looking for a date online and you're looking at different profiles on this website, and each profile that you're looking at has what people share about themselves, their picture, their interests, and besides that, their profile also has a match compatibility score as to the percentage that the website thinks that you're compatible with that person. So it turns out that after this whole Facebook news broke out, OkCupid thought that they would share the heat with Facebook in order to kind of lessen the heat individually for themselves. So they came out around that time and said, well, you know, it's not so bad what Facebook did, because what we actually did for months is that match compatibility score, we just made up that number to see what would happen. So for example, if you're like actually 97% compatible with somebody, the website might say that you're 22% compatible, just to see whether you're more or less likely to reach out to that person. So they'll show you some match compatibility score, and they'll see whether you message that person or not. And they wanted to know whether there was a correlation between the match compatibility score and how frequently you reach out to the new match. And so again, for months, they did this without telling people so that they could have a sample of OkCupid users that was truly random and didn't have any bias. So they didn't want the chance for these users to consent. And again, they wanted to reach a conclusion as to whether or not there was this correlation between users messaging and the actual match compatibility score. So while we're talking about it, what do you think the results were? Do you think the match compatibility score matters? Okay, so you would think so, but it turns out that it doesn't matter. And so what aspect of a user's profile do you think actually matters in determining whether somebody else will reach out to them?
And what they put in the profile to begin with.
Maybe, but more specifically,
Attractability.
yeah, it turns out that the picture. So the picture itself is really the only thing that they determine matters. So really, as a result of this study, that's why you had all these new companies that came out, like Tinder, like Bumble, where basically they focused only on the picture, swiping based on only the picture. And so for better or worse, these companies rode the coattails of this result. Any questions? And they were able to determine this because of, having a sample that was random without any bias. So not even volunteer bias. Any questions, comments? Okay. Okay, so in the time left, we said that the point of statistics was to collect a much smaller data set from the original population. We call that data set a sample. And we said what makes a good or an ideal sample, the first important characteristic is that it needs to be representative of the population. And we said that we don't want to have to think of every important attribute and make sure that each of those attributes are representative of the population. We said that was too tedious to do. So instead, we want to make sure that the collection of that sample is random. And so if it's random, then this issue of being representative takes care of itself. And then we also said that in most cases, practically speaking, we're always gonna have this legality issue most of the time with volunteer bias and giving the participants an opportunity to consent. Only in a few cases will we not have volunteer bias. But even with volunteer bias, the sample's not gonna be random. But if you only have one bias, like volunteer bias, not all biases are as bad as other biases. Not all biases are created equal. So if you have less biases, that's better. That makes it more random. So just because you have volunteer bias doesn't mean that you throw out the entire sample and you say this is a terrible sample, I'm not gonna continue. So even if you have one sample like volunteer bias, we can still move forward and we basically just account for that. And if we're communicating our results, we basically remind our audience that there's volunteer bias if they can't figure it out for themselves. But the point is that not all biases are equally bad. When we're constructing our sample, we just want to minimize the number of biases.